Now I'm very pleased to introduce the speakers from the National Institute on Aging, who are going to tell us a little bit about their divisions, what their priorities are, and at the end we're going to get them up here so that you can ask them questions. So if you have any questions, and remember Dr. Hodis the other day told us how much they like to be asked questions, so now we're going to see if that's really true or not. So the first speaker is John Hagee from the Behavioral and Social Science part. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. The most important line there is the penultimate one, the email addresses. One of my great achievements as director has been to standardize our email addresses so that you can reach any of us by first name dot last name at nih.gov. Since I was promised 20 minutes, I'm going to say other stuff too. Okay. What I thought I'd do today is not report on a lot of the science that our division has funded, but to, I can't, but I wanted to advance it. Oh, I'm going back. Oh. Not to report on a lot of the science, but to report on, sorry, no, which one? Ah, okay. Can I do it with this? Talk about some of the big challenges for behavioral and social science for the next decade. Goes forward. Let me tell you about these slides. Up, thanks. Would you mind?
Yeah, I got you.
Thank you. Forward. Thanks. And these are the two challenges that our division, this is not unique. You don't need to be working on one of these to contact us, but these are challenges that we see that the behavioral and social sciences can contribute to. Now, if I could leap ahead to the very last one. This is a record. It's sort of the scorecard. Life expectancy at age 65, an amalgam of all the death rates above that. Death is not the only health outcome we care about, but with one exception, almost all of the disparity stories that we have from using mortality data are also reflected in the disability and chronic disease prevalence data. Now, what you can't see there, the improvements, it's been just under 2 years for men in the U.S., I'm sorry, women in the U.S. Men are on the right there. Slightly more than that, almost 2.5 years added to life expectancy at age 65 for black women in the U.S. The reverse of, it's the reverse for men. This wouldn't be true if we moved it back and started at age 25. We would see much better performance by black men during this period. But this is basically almost the entire lifetime of our institute, and you can see there, I put in Canada. I could have chosen a whole bunch of countries. We've been caught and passed by all kinds of countries, not just other rich countries, but poorer countries like Slovenia, where the president's parents-in-law are from, Costa Rica, Chile. A lot of fairly poor countries have performed much better than the U.S. during this time. Now, can I go back to? So first, to talk about what we're going to do about dementia care. Move forward one now, thanks. This shows the period, the first decade of this century, and it's using a national level data set that was the Health and Retirement Study, which has cognitive measures and with probabilistic models connected to clinical assessments on a subsample, could look separately at trends for cognitively normal life expectancy, mild cognitive impairment, and dementia. Dementia's in red there. And what's happened, this is the good news, that for individuals and on a population average basis, the extra years we've added in life expectancy at older ages, this also is 65, have been mainly cognitively intact years. The red there is below the 0 line. There's actually been improvement in the number of years people can expect to live in dementia. So as the age at death has been increasing, the age at onset of dementia has been increasing even faster. This has been found in a few countries that have nationally representative data, and it's been going on for longer than just this century in the US. It's been going on since at least back to 1990. But we've separated them out by education. This, I should say, is women. There's a similar story for men. And the vast majority of the improvement, both in life expectancy and in dementia, has been for people with college education. There's been very little change in dementia for people with less than a college degree. That's the good news. The bad news is that the denominator is increasing greatly. We're right in the middle of a big run-up of the population aged 85 and over, which is at greatest risk. So even factoring in these improvements in prevalence rates, we're expecting very rapid increases in the number of persons with dementia. Even if all the science goes totally the way we want it, and you know, there are breakthroughs, trials are resulting really well, we're facing several decades with millions of families affected by dementia. We've had a complete breakdown in policymaking at the national level. People talk, it's very interesting to hear people talk about repealing the Affordable Care Act, appearing not to realize that a major part of it was repealed 6 years ago, the part dealing with long-term care for the elderly, the Class Act it was called. As part of a budget deal, that was repealed. So very little is happening in policy at the national level. All the problems that we forecast 10 years ago are still there and only getting worse. Some things are happening at state level, some of them informed by evidence, but it's quite clearly one of the major problems for the decade ahead. Move ahead. Now, what I said of dementia is also true of all other health issues. These are comparisons. The green is the cohort of people born in the 1930s. The orange is the cohort born in 1960. This is an estimate. Obviously, those 60 have not yet experienced much mortality, so it was using microsimulation. This was done for a Institute of Medicine panel a couple of years ago, again using health and retirement study data. What it's showing is that virtually all the improvement over generations has happened for women particularly to the top quintile, for men the top 3 quintiles of the income distribution. So when we're looking at zero improvement, we're not talking about desperately poor people, homeless, extreme poverty. We're talking about half the population. Move forward. And this illustrates a similar thing. I'm not going to explain all of the lines there, but the red is Costa Rica. The blue is the United States. The left panel is age 40 to 64, and the right is 60 plus, 65 to 80 rather. And this time it's age-standardized death rates. So high is bad, low is good. What you see is that in Costa Rica, the curves are much flatter. So if you're above the average in education and wealth, it's better to live in the US. If you're below the average, not the average for the pooled sample, but the average for your country, you're better off in Costa Rica. We have no good explanation for why this should be true. Now, we're seeing this in other health indicators. This is midlife using a data source called the MIDAS. What we're seeing is a decline in mental health, various aspects of mental health over the course of 20 years. And again, it's very much affected by socioeconomic status, how much the depreciation has happened. I should say this is not happening in other countries. Other countries are having greater economic inequality, but a recent study that we funded of 27 rich countries, the greater economic inequality is not reflected in mortality rates anywhere except here. Something is going on that's extremely upsetting. The lower rate, this now is a comparison of, I think it's 1990 is the start date, looking at life expectancy at age 65, so this is older people death rates, by metropolitan status. And non-metro areas for both men and women have clearly fallen behind. So something's going on particularly badly in the non-metropolitan counties. This again is age standardized death rates, and I think the cutoff now is age 55. We paid for this to be online so people could look and see how their state's doing. The dotted line is the US average, which, as you saw from the earlier one, is anemic by world standards, but generally improvement. The one way down there, that's Hawaii. The red one's Alabama. So despite all the improvements that we've had in what we understand in clinical practice, Alabama's pretty much back where it was after a rise and then a fall, back where it was 1990. So the progress in all the science that we've had is not reflected in health improvements for older people in Alabama. This is women. There's a similar graph for men. What you also notice is, or maybe can't notice so much here, is we've had a geographic sorting out. In the 1970s and 80s, there was no particular pattern. Among the worst states was California, Iowa. Since then, we've had a clear sorting out so that the Southeast, Southwest, Mississippi Delta, a big chunk of the Midwest have failed to improve. The coasts and the upper Midwest is where all of the national improvement has happened. We're not bi-coastal institutes of health, so this ought to be a major concern at NIH. Usually when I present anything like this at NIH, the reaction is sort of, gee, it's a damn shame. I wish somebody would do something about it. And we're National Institutes of Health. This ought to be our problem. And what I really like to do is to emphasize this is something that science can do something about. There's interesting and complex science behind what's happening to population health. There's also interesting interventions or changes that are indicated. Next one, please. This slide is county level. We commissioned this from the Census Bureau. There's a whole series of maps which we've now had posted. It's using the American Community Survey. And what we look at is various combinations of disadvantage. We call them colloquially the SOL maps. So these are where people, older people, are living alone, reporting a disability, and near poverty rates, and the darker counties are worst off. Again, same as at the state level, the story is increasing regional fractionation. So part of the US is doing, I think I used the word mediocre, the original word was craptastic, but parts of the US are doing okay in international standards by health improvement. But large chunks of the United States are doing very little improvement at all. This is just to say that most of the research we fund, including in our division, is looking at individual behavior and ways to change individual behavior to try to improve some of these outcomes. It's important stuff, and we're going to continue to do it, and it helps to look under the hood and see when people have cracked fan belts and overheated coolant. However, there's also, that doesn't solve traffic jams. There's also a need for interventions that address health at a more population level. We've had some research addressing these. We've tried to stimulate, including intervention studies, which I'd be happy to be asked about or to talk about. I think I'm not giving something away when I say this is a wide open field. This is very important work. It's unexplained scientifically why, it's easy to explain why it's worse to be poor than to be rich. It's very hard to explain why it's worse to be poor in 2019 than it was in 1970. It's also very hard to explain why it's worse to be poor and uneducated in Iowa than in Tennessee. Now, there are people working on this, and there's a lot of interesting science to be done, but I would encourage people to get interested. On the dementia care one, we've also had Richard Hodis yesterday describe this accretion of dedicated money that we've had thanks to hard work by supporters and friends outside NIH. And we're trying to put a major effort on an area that we feel has been very neglected, which is looking at care. What are we doing for people with dementia and for their caregivers and families now? We've had some very interesting research successes. Very little of that, with a few good exceptions like the Veterans Administration, have been translated into programs that are reaching many people. There's one famous estimate that evidence-based long-term care is reaching less than 3% of caregivers for elderly with dementia now, and there's no prospect of that growing as the numbers grow that I showed without some major changes in the organization and financing of care. Can I move forward? I won't describe this one, partly because Richard mentioned it yesterday, but the key point is this was done in inner city Baltimore. Nearly all the beneficiaries or the participants in the study were elderly living alone, most of them women. So it was a particularly good example of something that looked like it worked in the settings that we most want to see improvement. Now here's the key thing. This is the staff of the Behavioral and Social Research Division with a couple of new people and with sort of brief descriptions of the kind of areas that they're covering. What they all have in common is they're all public servants, which means you're paying their salaries. And they're all supposed, a big part not only of their duties, but of what's satisfying about their jobs is seeing people who have an idea but may not know a great deal about the different mechanisms, about the review process, about funding opportunities, and about different institutes' interests. Seeing them get connected with the right place is a big part of what makes our jobs fun and interesting. So please use them. I have a couple of tips, if we could go forward one, on how to use your NIH program officer. Email rather than calls. The phone calls are very hit or miss. And very often the first person or the person whose name you know really isn't the right person to help you. So it's not like the Department of Motor Vehicles where you go to one window and they slam and, you know, I'm on my break or something. Well, sometimes we are, but usually when we send you on to someone else, it doesn't mean your research is not interesting or even I'm not interested in it. What it means is John King is the right guy, or Georgianne Patmios, or one of them have been going to the review meetings relevant to what you're doing. They can help forecast, they can help you figure out what's going to be a big review concern in this particular field and the rest. Sometimes we'll even refer you to a different institute. The Division of Labor at NIH is based on historic accidents of when Congress was persuaded to set up an institute. We're all separately authorized. So they don't make total scientific or intellectual sense. And that's great. We love the autonomy and having, 27 different flowers blooming. But the price you pay for it is that it's very often not obvious from the website who the right person is. So you don't need to psych it all out, and you don't need to be monogamous. Just contact any of us who look plausible, and part of our job is to send you over to, you know what, I'm not the right person, but Karen Huss at the National Institute on Nursing Research knows all about this. She's recently gotten some money for it. Let me put you in touch with her. So that's part of our service, is actually shunting you off to the right place rather than a sign that we're not interested. The final bit there, after the summary statement is posted, I have to keep reminding the folks who work for me who love to chat about what they think happened at the review and what we heard over the phone with this scratchy AV system at a review meeting in California, and our opinion of what someone, none of it counts. When you write a resubmission, what matters is what's in the summary statement. So I try to get everybody focused, and you can help by focusing yourself on what's written down in the summary statement that you get for every application, even if, like half of them, it's not discussed at that meeting. 3 people and a review officer have put a lot of attention into trying to get down on words what they were thinking. That, rather than a program officer's guess based on a couple of facial expressions or something, is what's going to be in front of the reviewers for the resubmission that you write. So those are my recommendations. A couple of years ago, I wrote 2 blog posts on our blog that Richard referred to, elaborating on these, but really this slide is good enough. Thanks. Skip this. I am well aware that this is not Tuscaloosa.
Thank you, John. I'm really glad you noticed this is not Tuscaloosa. We're very pleased about that. Our next speaker is Evan Hadley, who directs the Geriatrics and Clinical Gerontology Division at the NIA. Evan?
Hi. So should I try to use these? Or this one? Well, thanks very much. I'm really glad to be here at this really extraordinarily well-organized conference. It's really, I haven't seen many like this. So our division handles most of the clinical research other than behavioral and neurosciences. As you can see from the name, we focus both on issues for older people in the geriatrics branch, but also aging across the lifespan in the clinical gerontology branch. And because we do a lot of clinical trials, we have a branch especially for that because it's science in its own right. And we don't do all the clinical trials at NIA, but we do a great majority of them, again, outside of behavioral health services and neuroscience. I'm not going to present a long list of the topic areas we have. That's available on the website. And I was going to talk through some of the topics that John mentioned on his really excellent last slide about how to talk to your program official, which I am going to ask him to lend me a copy of very shortly after this meeting. That was really useful. So whatever he said applies really for all divisions at NIA. That was really excellent. So you can find that contacts for our staff on the website and follow the strategy that John outlined. The one thing I would call your attention to is in red letters, the TBA. Is this going to work for you? Here, we've recently been approved to add a position in clinical trials specifically focused on clinical trials of geroscience-related interventions. This is going to be a challenging new area with a lot of emphasis probably on early-stage trials at the beginning. But if you or you know someone who would be interested in joining our merry band, we'd very much like to hear from you. So instead of going through the whole span of interest of the division, which you can learn more about on the website, what I thought I'd do here is talk about some of the topics at this conference that came up and some of our interests related to that. And so the first one here is on protective factors for human longevity and health span. And a couple of things I want to talk about here are a collection of fairly large-scale studies that are focused on this. And this began first with studies on centenarians and other long-lived populations to learn about these protective factors that would account for a long human lifespan. That then was extended to long-lived families, which provides added ways of looking at particularly genetic and other familial factors that provide to long life, why some families just seem to, generation after generation, seem to produce more long-lived individuals. And from there, we went to the genetic studies and, of course, finding polymorphisms that are related to human longevity. But then, of course, with the recognition that the genes themselves aren't going to tell you the pathways that get you to longevity, so that has gotten us into omic studies. And I should mention, too, that these studies aren't exclusively in my division, Max's division in particular, and also our division of neurosciences, often are engaged in these projects collaboratively with us. And then, of course, with all the omics and the massive data that those generate, that leads to the potential uses for computational strategies to address this, including computational chemistry to look at new drugs or existing drugs that can be repurposed to address the findings that we get from the omics functional studies. So this is a big challenge, and integrating these, I think, is really crucial to get the synergy that could come out of them. We've been trying to think of a name to address this collection here. First, we thought of the longevity complex, but that sounds too psychiatric. Then we thought of longevity multiplex, but that sounds too much like a movie theater. Then we thought of longevity collection, but that sounds like something you see at a clothing store. So we're still working on what to call all this, trying to integrate these things. But it is very important. It's really thinking about kind of meta-science, how you can get these studies to share data, integrate analysis, and so forth. So that's a big focus of us. And we have a AAAS fellow from working with us to help us thinking about that. The other thing I wanted to bring out is that we appreciate more and more is that to get at factors that predispose or conducive to human longevity and potential intervention, it's really valuable not to confine the data that we look at just to human data, and specifically the importance of using comparative biology data in this. And the virtue of that is the signal strength that you can get from comparative biology. Though, of course, there is a lot of variation in humans, and we focus on that a lot. really, the ratio of maximum human lifespan and mean human lifespan, it's only about 1.4. And there's a lot you can get from that, and we're going to get a lot from that. But in many of the mechanisms that really may affect longevity may be the ones contributing to the bigger differences in species longevity. Just for example, in the primates, where there can be at least a 8 or 10-fold range of primates lifespans. So how to integrate data from comparative biology, most of which really is supported through Max's program, he may mention that, but how to integrate that data into these efforts here on human longevity and deal with the challenges there of orthology and homology and so forth, I think both offers a real potential for much better insights in really important factors affecting human longevity, but also challenges in how to integrate that data. So that's something that we're thinking about a lot. Then, this has come up several times in the meetings, geroscience-related human intervention studies. And there's a few factors here that I think are both exciting and challenging. And the first one is just to get human markers of the status of these mechanisms that are proposed to influence aging, that is proteostasis or mitochondrial function and so on, DNA damage and so forth. There's just, obviously, you're limited for ethical and other reasons of what you can gather in humans, and many times you're really confined to circulating markers and so forth. So this is not easy to do, and again, jointly with Max's division, we have projects working on this, but I would point this out as just a general topic that we hope there's interest in spontaneous activity on this as well. This is going to be crucial, I think, for a couple of reasons. One of which is just assessing if you're going to have intervention studies on this. Then are you getting target engagement? Are you hitting the mechanism that you're trying to hit? I mean, that's kind of the premise of geroscience. I think that's very important. And also as then surrogate markers that can be used in earlier stage studies to see whether you've got something that maybe is appropriate for a larger study on a clinical outcome. The second big issue in this issue is related to the premise in geroscience that targeting an aging mechanism has the potential to affect multiple aging outcomes, not just one particular age-related disease. But that the design issues for a trial like that, in terms of this is it really in the clinical trial zoology issues, which really relate ultimately to FDA approval and other factors, is how do you design that? How do you select a primary outcome? There's a lot of strategies. You could pick one aging outcome at a time and look and see for one trial after another that has pluses but also minuses. You can try a variety of composite outcomes or multiple individual outcomes. Really issues, because though, of course, the hope would be you'd have an intervention that's good for 5 different aging outcomes. It might not be that way. It might be good for 5 and bad for 3 other ones, or good for 3 and bad for 2. So how you design a trial to address those contingencies, I think, is going to be really crucial. It's important to address, but there are real design issues on that, and that's some of the things we're facing. And I did want to point out, too, that though, of course, a lot of the focus on geroscience has been related to the collection of factors that related to the pillars of aging and certain classes like senolytics that are important, we're paying attention to. Let's see, did this get? Oh, yes, I should mention this, too. I forgot we had this. Related to a lot of these issues is a network that we recently funded, led by Jim Kirkland, but with involvement by many others, including Steve Krzyzewski and other people, in terms of the Translational Geroscience Network, addressing some of the things I just talked about, in terms of kind of having use case trials that could be a paradigm for other trials, assay facilities for the kinds of predictive marks I was talking about, and then especially as at the beginning there were likely to be a lot of small studies, getting synergy out across study comparisons, and other repositories for the data that comes out of this. Here, what I want to stretch here is that this network already involves a lot of people, but they're clearly at their first meeting they are interested in outreach and interfacing with all the other investigators working on this. So I think the potential here, again, to get synergy and interaction among the various independent people working on this is really going to be crucial, as opposed to just having a lot of one-off studies from individual groups. But I did want to mention one other thing that I think it can be considered as related to geroscience, though the concept was around long before the term geroscience was popularized and spread, and that is caloric restriction, which has, of course, been known in laboratory animals for really now for more than 8 decades, I think, to both slow multiple aging outcomes, just as a geroscience premise, and to extend lifespan. And as many of you may know, that we not too long ago had a human study of a 2-year intervention of the calorie study. And we do know how to spend calorie, by the way. That's our cute acronym there, which I sometimes remember what the words are. But the point I just want to bring out here, which the study made a lot of findings, but here, using an index of biological aging that took into account physiological factors and so forth, even in that 2-year study, there was a significant slowing of the rate of aging by this particular measure. So I think the questions now are, because the calorie not only did this, but really also favorably affected multiple risk factors, particularly for cardiometabolic age-related diseases, is what would happen if this was extended longer. And this was a relatively feasible level of CR, about 12%. And which was sustained for 2 years. And there's a lot of doubt whether we could do that, and we did. The interest now is what longer-term effects might be, and we have plans for a longer, probably a 5-year study comparing caloric restriction, perhaps with other interventions like intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding. But here, what I really just want to bring out is the calorie generated a lot of biospecimens, which have proved to be valuable, particularly for some of these mechanistic marker studies we talked about. But this is open to requests. And the calorie website, there are those interested in looking analysis using both the data and the specimens. We'd encourage you to consider using those. Then on public health clinical trials, I thought the presentations related to diversity yesterday were really important. And what I wanted to add to that is, in addition to the demographic factors, in terms of demographic subgroups and different ages. In trials in the older populations, it's even bigger than that. There's just diversity among clinical factors within the geriatrics population. You may have heard the Jack Rowe quote from long ago, that is, when you've seen one geriatric patient, you've seen one geriatric patient. There's just so many differences in the pattern of comorbidities they have, the medications they're taking, the degree of progression of the chronic diseases they have, so that to make a blanket public health statement, for example, the example of the aspirin trial that Richard alluded to yesterday, it's true on a population basis, but it still leaves innumerable questions open about particular subgroups. People are using particular medications, and this is still true for that aspirin data too, or people with different comorbidities, as well as different demographic populations, ethnicity, income too, which John alluded to. So the challenge here is how you get the kind of power that lets you pre-specify subgroups and really address some of those really important questions that are important at the individual level. So we're coming to grips with how to do that. You can get big samples with a pragmatic trial, but then it's often hard to get the detailed information. We're starting a large trial on whether statin use benefits exceed adverse effects in people over 75, which, as many of you know, has been a big controversy in clinical research. And this is going to be a trial of about 20,000 people using healthcare systems. But just to take the example, we want to know effects on dementia. That's not that easy to get out of healthcare system records. So I think we have a strategy that can do that. But that's just one example, and those same issues of heterogeneity there are going to be important. And particularly, again, in terms of demographic recruitment, I really took to heart the message in the talk is that I think the degree of advanced preparation and contact with communities is really important. And we have a one-year protocol refinement phase, and it really brought home to me that during that phase, I think would be the time to do a lot of piloting and outreach efforts. Probably should have started well before that, but I think that's going to be really important so that we can have a trial that really at least addresses some of those diversity issues. On physical disability, my sense of where we are on this is we've done some kind of trials with what you can do now, that is in terms of physical activity, and there will be more. But for example, the LIFE trial that was alluded to showing that a physical activity intervention could delay onset of mobility disability, I think has set an example of what can be done. But there's just so much to learn now about what are the bases, more about the bases of physical disability in terms of mechanisms and muscle function and neuromotor function for that matter, and the mechanisms responsible for influencing responses to exercise, why some people do better and why don't. And we saw some examples of that in the talks yesterday, and of course Dr. Bauman's group here is a leader in that, but there's just a ton to be done on that. We participate in MotorPack, but it's in terms of the aging kind of aspect of that Trans NIH Institute, that's not going to answer all the questions. I hope it can be expanded or related studies could be added to that. There's a lot to do there. We're funding a project called SAMA, which is also addressing some of those issues. But there are just a lot of research needed there, and I think UAB is one of the places that can really contribute to that. Just on interdisciplinary aging research, again, I think that's been alluded to. There's a lot of things that can be talked about, but I just wanted to call attention to one, and this is the Research Centers Collaborative Network. This is something I started advocating a few years ago, and at the beginning of NIA, as usual, there's always kind of people concerned about turf, and there's a little suspicion of this, but this really did catch on, and we were able to issue a solicitation for this. This is a network across all the center's programs, and I've been extremely impressed with how rapidly it's taken off in terms of exchange of information, and I have to credit Steve with a really important role in this in the executive committee. Probably a great contribution to how quickly this has taken off. And again, this is not just our division, all four divisions, and John's division in particular playing a leading role from the NIA side. But I think the point here is I think this is really valuable, and not just for the people funded by the centers directly, but at their institutions as well. So I hope this spreads out and has benefits even beyond the centers. And finally, just resources. There are a lot of NIA resources that can be alluded to. You'll see that on the website. But one that I did want to talk about, just because it's new, again, this is for all of NIA, not just my division, is the new Aging Research Biobank. One of the problems we've had with our studies, especially the human studies, is the repositories were funded off the grant, and then what happens when the grant is over, and that got very difficult. And so it took a lot of struggling with the contracts mechanism, but finally a way was found to do this. So now we have a contract, ongoing supported, stable mechanism to house specimens from many of the NIA-supported studies, and importantly, the data that goes with it and the informatics that will help people use it. So it's not just a bunch of vials stored someplace, it's also the information to help use it, and the phenotypic data from the studies. So we have alluded to the LIFE study. That's one that's using the SWAN study on menopause. And there's other ones that are being added. I've been impressed how rapidly interest in this has been spread from people who want to use this resource to keep the specimens from their studies. This is open to requests from any researcher, and we're already seeing, I think, an increase in the research benefits from this. I'd encourage you to take a look at this. Again, it's not the only resource. I know Luigi also has specimen resources too, and that are very valuable as well. But this is an important, valuable one. And that's it for me.
So next speaker will be Max Guo from the Division of Aging Biology. Max?
Thank you all for staying, and thank you, Steve, and other organizers for the invitation. Right? My name is Max Guo from Division of Aging Biology. My division director, Dr. Sierra, was supposed to be here, but he has some urgent and private thing to deal with. So he sent me to represent DAB. So he gave me his talk a few days ago, and I'm supposed to give his talk, But on my way here, I changed my mind and decided to give a different talk. So Steve, don't tell him that. so from his, point of view, right? So his view would be from top to bottom, right? At my point, I will provide a view from bottom up, right? My purpose of this talk is try to provide you some useful information for your future grant, funding. So I will give you a very brief introduction about DAB. I know you don't care that much, right? But a major part of my talk, going to talk about some trend in the research funded by DAB. I think, when you think about your next grant, you can think about, this ongoing trend. Then in the end, I will spend a few minutes to talk about the important issues for, grant funding. So just a big picture from the top, NIH has, 28 institute or centers. NIA is one of them. And NIA has both intramural and extramural. Dr. Ferrucci is the director of the intramural. They spend about 10 to 15% of the NIA budget. The rest of the money goes to extramural. So for the, John just gave a talk about the BSR, and Evan talked about GCG. Division of Neuroscience not here today. I represent DAB. So there are three branches, genetics and cell biology branch, aging physiology branch, and resources branch. There are a bunch of the program officers here. I don't have to go through them. And the DAB support research on the basic mechanism of aging biology using many different animal models and the human. Right? We study DNA, gene, chromosome, cell, organ to an organism. And we even study cohort of animals or human. Right? So we also provide support to the research community. So pretty much DAB covers almost the whole spectrum of this meeting, right, from chromosome to the community. So now I switch gear to talk about some ongoing trend of the research. So first trend is, seems that we are going beyond, gene discovery or single gene kind of approach, right? So in the past 20 years, we have found, hundreds of genes important for lifespan or aging, right? So 20 years ago, if you found gene in worm, so you can publish a paper in Nature, then get a 5-year grant from NIA. But now, to do that, you have to, do much more, go much deeper, right? So some, ongoing effort is, not just, a single strain of the worm, right? You have to go for the different genetic background, different animal models, using different species, try to confirm. Sometimes you even have to go to human samples. And we do have some emerging interests in this area, for example, Tom, talk about, microbiome and microbiota, right? So we are also pushing for integrated physiology, and some tools, for example, tissue on chip, organoid is being considered, AI, and I also organized, a workshop on some stochastic nature of aging, and they appear to be interesting, but we still don't know what to do in this area. The second major trend is, in many research areas, other than aging, many things are going on, right? So much has been done, but we don't know what happens, during aging, right? So Darren Baker gave a very good example. I use that, here to show my point. For example, cell cycle, right? So 10 years ago, or even 6 years ago, when Darren started, I don't know whether he's still here, he was not working on aging. So he was working on cell cycle and a gene called BOB-R1. This is a gene involved in spindle checkpoint, right? So look at what he has done when he started to check aging, right? So he told you the story yesterday. I don't have to repeat that. But in many research areas, right? For example, cell cycle, right? Cell division, spindle, cytoskeleton, right? There is so much details, unknown, right? But we don't know much about aging, right? My wife is a cell biologist. She always, talk to me about, what's going on in her field, right? So I'm amazed, how much they know and how little we do, in that field in terms of aging. So I think those are the low-hanging fruit, right? We should consider as a community. Maybe, we should, talk to our neighbors, team up, and try to get into the field, you are not in yet, right? So I have a few, area here, and so at least 3 are phase. By the way, so if I show them in red, they are active. You can still submit in response to this R phase, right? So there's some active R phase, I think, related to this effort happening in my division. The third trend, we try to provide new and better animal models, right? So of course, no animal model is perfect, right, except for human, right? But they can provide, some advantage in, studying certain aspect of aging, right? So, for example, the reason to use naked morad and African killifish are opposite, right? So, but they are useful for us to understand certain aspect of aging. In the same trend, right, not just aging model, we are also interested in better translational animal models. Parabiosis, 2 years ago, we issued 2 RFAs, right? So now we have, several projects funded, ongoing. I hope, exciting things would happen in a few years. Then for dog, we funded a big dog project to study rapamycin, intervention, right? So it's U19. This was funded, I think, also, 2 years ago. It's ongoing, right? For marmoset, we do have an active, RFA on the street, so we think this is an interesting animal model, and I hope going to be useful, for the aging community. Next trend. DAB have always tried to provide, better tools and resources for the community, right? So we have been providing aging, rodents and tissues and cell, and some private, tissue bank, right? So we set up, mouse intervention testing program, also try to provide, knowledge and resources for the community. And a couple years ago, we also started a worm intervention testing program called CITP. We will be open for proposals, of the compound to be tested for this program. We have 3 active RFAs, related to this effort. And in the future, there is some area we are thinking about it, for example, imaging, right? So that's another good example. So much advances have been, happening, but aging as a field are not taking advantage of it. For example, imaging, right? We are thinking about to do something about, imaging, and 3D culture, tissue on chip, organoid, and also we are thinking about rodent aging phenotyping and pathology, services or tools. I cannot promise, we will get these things ready, but we are thinking about those 3 areas as example. So another big thing, big trend, right? In the DAB supported research is about integration, right? So this is our view of the integration. I won't be able to walk you through all the details, but what I want to say is, you have to put your study in the bigger picture, right? So you should try to integrate your data with other people's data, try to come up with something deeper and bigger, right? Another thing is you also should try to make your data available to others. Others can do the same. Try to integrate their data with your data. Try to come up with something bigger and better, right? So I think, we are quite, happy about some ongoing effort. I think, we will continue to do that. So a final trend I want to mention here is geroscience, right? Evan mentioned that, Dr. Richard Hodis also mentioned that, right? So aging is a major risk factor for most adult, chronic diseases, right? We all say that. But in fact, we don't know what is this specific factor, right? What's happening, after you become old that would become a risk for, all these kind of diseases. Is that a common risk or many different kind of changes, they share among different kind of, diseases? We don't know, right? So we try to, figure out, so, there are many ongoing efforts, right? One of the efforts, is, about metformin. We think metformin, sounds like a very promising tool to test this, geroscience hypothesis. We have RFA on the street. The due date is next January. Try to, understand basic mechanism of metformin that, Evans division and the DAB are doing it together, right? So I think, we also interested in some, other studies in cancer and diabetes, but they have to come to aging and try to understand. We are interested in metformin as a tool to interrogate, this geroscience hypothesis. So I mentioned 6 ongoing trends. I think, this will be useful for you to consider in your future grant, submission. But there are some other things going on I don't have time to mention, but I want to get to the most important part of my talk that you cared about. It's about the grant funding. Right? So I think, for the people in the room, you had some, 20-some good years, right, after you were born, right? After, college, if you choose to take a dark path, right, get into the research, right, then you have to deal with the grant, right? So the good thing is, we have, many different mechanisms, right? So while your career goes on, you have more and more options, and we just try to keep you busy, right? I don't have time to walk through all the details because, I have, 7 minutes. Here, I just want to emphasize some things important for the young people. We have a new mechanism called F99 here. This is a new mechanism which you can get as a graduate student, then take the money to your postdoc, studies, right? So this provides you options, and also, if where you want to go doesn't have enough funding, I think you can still do what you want to do. This is a new mechanism for graduate student, you can look into it. The other mechanism is called DP5. It's a NIH Common Fund program. So this DP5 is a position called a super postdoc, right? You don't have to do postdoc. You're super postdoc because you are your own boss. You transition from a graduate school, right? After you get a PhD, you become a PI, right? Then, have independent research program. This DP5 is for those people, right? As a graduate student, you don't have to, go through the postdoc stage. You can be, your own boss and have independent program right away if you are doing well, during the graduate school. Another thing I want to mention is K99 R00. This is not new, right? So, but it's very important, right? So as a postdoc, right, if you can get it, that will help you to get a job, right? Because you carry another 3 years of funding, almost, as a small R01, right, to your, independent faculty position. Many institutions, like that, because you have money and the track record, that's going to help you to get a job. Yeah. So many people, call us asking about, things confusing to them, right? So, I mean, because, they don't understand the whole, the basics of NIH. Here, I just want to mention, a simple thing, right? So NIH budget consists of three things, right? Most of the money already committed, because when the grant funded, you fund the grant, most of them are multi-years. For example, R1, 5 years, right? After this year, you still have to give them money for, 4 more years. So those are the committed funds, and most of the money are committed already, right? Then each year, grant, some grant will end, right? Then, have some, money free to fund a new grant. So this is uncommitted fund, right? Then each year, NIH budget could increase, could decrease. If it increase, that get into the pool to fund new grant, right? But if decrease, right, it would cut into this, uncommitted fund, right? So that means we cannot fund, as many new grants. So many variables. When people call us, often I tell them, I don't know, whether your grant is going to be funded, right? So they're not very happy because they don't know the outcome. So this kind of uncertainty, worries them. But they called, so many variables. Most of the time, we don't know until end of the fiscal year. And also because the factors I just mentioned, right? So each year, NIH period are different. I put 3 years here. You can see, the new investigator and the early stage investigator are always better by 3 or 5%. So I won't walk you through, but the point is this, they're variable, right? So, they vary from year to year, right? So when you have, a score, most of the time, you and we don't know the outcome, near the end of the fiscal year. So I have about 3 or 4 minutes. I just want to give some advice on the grant writing, right? So I don't have time to talk about everything, but these are the few things, I think is important, right? So first, come to the point, right? So when you study gene, you don't have to tell people, how DNA was discovered or, how James Watson discovered DNA structure. Come to your point. You have limited space. Try to focus on that, right? Second thing, draw a picture, right? Diagram for your study. This is very useful, right? For you to think and write about your grant, and also guide the reviewer to read your grant. This is, useful, So you should think about, have a diagram when you submit a grant, right? Another thing is the data, right? People tend to, squeeze, all they have into the grant, try to, convince reviewer how much they have done. You don't have to do that, right? So because you don't have that much space, right? And also, if you make figures so small, a figure origin so small, and reviewers just get pissed, right? I know, now with the PDF, right? So you can try to zoom in and read, whatever small figure in the world you have. But, your intention pisses off the reviewer. They think you try to game the system, right? So I think just try to put most critical, data in there and making the point, and that's going to help you, right? Then when you write the grant, make sure, you have some alternative approach, right? Because, your grant study based on hypothesis, the one possibility is you are wrong, right? If you are wrong, what are you going to use the money for, right? So now I'm getting to my, final slides here, right? So these are some general, advice for you folks to prepare next grant, right? So for young people, you need to know the grant funding process. That's what we are doing now here, right? So visit NIH CSR, NIA website, right? Try to see what's the emphasis, what's the funding priority, whether there is some, RFAs, right? So that lead to third one, fund, RFAs, funding opportunity announcement, right? Try to read them very carefully, right? Whether, your study would fit, whether it's good for you, right? Then talk to your program officer, they mentioned many times. And the number 5 is know who the reviewers are, because this is important, right? So if a reviewer in your, field, And I had, a very important, study, right? So make sure you don't forget to cite his paper, right? Otherwise, I'm sorry to say, you'll have to resubmit. So number 6 is, try to make the whole grant, cohesive, right? So very often, we read grants 3 or 4 aims going to the different direction are not connected, right? So for the grant, have to be cohesive. It's a one story you tell, right? Don't try to go separate, direction. If you go separate direction, write, several grants, right? So then, ask your friend to read your grant, right? So, and tell them to criticize. Make sure, they are not going to be the nice guys, tell you all the good things. They are not useful, right? Just, ask them to tell you those nasty criticism. So, at the time, you can still change and revise, right? Otherwise, reviewer going to ask those kind of nasty criticism, right? So you will know, better sooner than the time of the review, right? The final advice is, try to participate in the study section, because I think that's your best training on writing a good grant, right? Because you know how reviewer criticize other grant, right? So then what's the criteria, how it reviewed. Then when you write the grant, then you know how to write the grant, so you don't have to be criticized in the same fashion in that study section. I think I'll stop here. Here, I just want to advertise this, meeting, the 3rd Geroscience Summit next month at NIH. I hope you can attend, or, you can, watch on the internet. Thank you. I stop here, and I think we still have time to answer your questions.
Thank you, Max. Well, here's your big opportunity. You don't often have the opportunity to have this much representation from the National Institute of Aging here. Does anyone have any questions for? Okay, let's go. 1, 2.
So that was a terrific set of presentations. So Max, in the continuum that you presented from chromosomes all the way to clinical trials, you had this rather thin line between animal and human application. But I think there's a larger gap than you're representing, because that study section, especially when you want to do early proof of principle modeling, you have the basic scientists say you're not accounting for the pleiotropic effects of your intervention, and the bar is very high from an animal science point of view. But the clinicians are saying, well, I don't see the clinical relevance of that. So how are we going to bridge this gap between the basic scientists and the clinicians to be able to talk to each other and be open-minded enough to consider things at the other end of the spectrum?
I think we both can answer. I think it is.
Let's use your microphone.
Let me see.
How long an answer do you want? Enough to get another grant fund.
Yeah, it is a big issue, right? So I think that's an issue we discuss all the time at NIA, right? So I think Evan is at a better position to address this. We have, many ongoing interactions.
I think you need to speak into the microphone. People in the back can't hear.
It's a really important issue. There's a couple of things you talk about, and the first thing I'm going to is what you talked about is in other words, a study that really crosses and integrates across that boundary. I think that just the kind of studies we need a lot more of, rather than just have clinical style studies in one silo and the basic in another silo. So it is a real challenge, and we have, in fact, we have continuing dialogue with the Center for Scientific Review at NIH about this, how these study sections could be constituted. I'd be too euphoric if I say we've got all this worked out. It is a challenge. There are some study sections that have done this to some degree, and we're hoping to do is get either additional study section or change in distribution of the expertise on the study section to get the combination of that. But even that, I don't want to be Pollyannish. Even if they're in the same study section, if you have a division of opinion between clinically oriented and basic oriented, one of them will love it and the other one will not. And when you have a division like that, you don't get a fundamental score. So that is a challenge. What we're trying to do is especially just find researchers who have the perspective to bridge that and get them on study sections. That's one. The other thing is, I think it's fair to say, is when we do targeted solicitations that are aimed at that, and you then have a special emphasis panel or other ad hoc constructed study sections in which the rationale for that bridging is presented to the study section as part of the review, then I think it's fair to say, Max, when you have those target initiatives where you get a special study section, then you get that integration of perspective better. But it's a big ig We're working on it. I can't say how long it's going to take. It's probably never going to be perfectly resolved, but that's the best. I think we're doing the best we can. It's a big focus, I know, for our two divisions. But John may comment on both perspectives on behavioral science as well.
No, can I just say you reminded me of an issue that Max mentioned. Look and see who the reviewers are. You'll get a robo email about 3 or 4 weeks before the review, not from us, but from the system, with a link to who are the reviewers. And especially if you're working in these boundary or integrated areas, please do look at that. After the review happens, there's virtually nothing we can do to repair the damage. Before the review happens, we can point out to the review officer that there's, missing expertise, or there's another more appropriate study section or something. And the people who do the review never realized we challenged their expertise, or that all this is invisible to them. The key thing being that you responded quickly when you saw that email, and if there is a problem, talk to the program and review officers about it. We can do almost nothing after the review has happened, but everything can be done quietly before the review has happened. Obviously, we can't, rig it so all your friends are on it or something. That doesn't happen. But honest, genuine concerns about the expertise of the reviewing panel are something we should be able to respond to.
And just one final thing is to remember, persistence is rewarded. It is a lot of times that lack of appreciation across that divide comes out on the original application, but if an effort is really made to address that, sometimes on the A1 or subsequent application, it does better. And sometimes, probably in more cases, it's usually not the initial application that makes it. It's the second one.
So I just like to say that locally here, we're trying to address this by organizing meetings like this, where the basic scientists and the clinicians and all can talk to one another, because I think we all get a lot out of that.
Sure. Hi, I'm a second-year PhD student in the rehabilitation science program, and I'm interested in creative expression and its effects on cognitive impairment and mood disturbances. And I was wondering, within the NIH, for us up-and-coming PhD students who might be interested in these alternative interventions for people as they age and its contribution to healthy aging, is there a place for us, and where can we start?
Thank you. There's a group they're lumped together as non-pharmacological interventions, and they're split pretty much 50-50 across our division and the division of neuroscience. And you don't need to worry about the split. We're not, we all got our straws in the same drink here. So, but you may have seen things, Julian Johnson's study of community choirs and several different outcome variables for that. And there's a new initiative with the National Endowment of the Arts on that they're tremendously interested in the effects of arts practice and education on older people. So there's interest and buzz surrounding that. My colleague Lisa Onken is she'll guide you. It might be us, it might be the Division of Neuroscience, but she would be a good guide to that.
Other questions?
Thank you all. Like Steve mentioned, just here locally, we're trying to kind of get across centers talking a little more. I was wondering if you all could just speak to the RCCN and what all the activities are now that you see ongoing, and then kind of how you see it working right now and adapting going forward.
I can say a little bit, but John's staff as well. But also, and Steve may want to, as I said, Steve has I think, really contributed to this on the executive committee, and actually may be closer to some activities than me. The ones I can attest to, and I say I'm impressed how quickly it's gotten off the ground, are the webinar series that they've been doing. It's like one after another, and really spanning the different interests of the center. They seem to be getting interest from multiple centers on a topic. I think just that in itself is valuable. Some of the other things we hoped for would be that it could facilitate cross-research experience exposures from people who learn, like in one center, learning of something being done by a colleague in another center that they might not have found out about it if it were not for the RCCN. So I honestly don't know how far that is proceeded, but it could happen as well. So those are the and simply also just getting the information out about what's going on in the centers and the databases they have. Again, that's, I think, in progress, but I really appreciate what Steve would have to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big opportunities of the RCCN, first of all, for those of you here, if you want to know what's going on, you can talk to me. I'm in the executive committee. I kind of know. But these cross-center grants that we give out as well, I think, are really trying to stimulate this research. And I know we have at least one application on the latest round from UAB, so we're working on that. Other questions?
I have one. Thank you for your talks today and all of them at this symposium. And I'm happy to see the microbiome as an emerging area of research interest, and hoping that there will be more studies on nutrition and diet effects on aging, and in particular plant-based diets. And I wonder what you think about that.
I can say something, and Max too. So no, we're seeing the kind of ascending arm of the curve on this already, and so we are seeing more investigator-initiated applications of it. And I think as issues get clearer, it may lead to some specific NIA initiatives. So far, that's not in view, but I think it could certainly happen in the not-too-distant future. One thing I could mention is on plant-based diets. I mentioned a set of that we have planning activities for trials that would follow the calories trial of caloric restriction. And what we're thinking about is the potential for a possible multi-arm study that would have a variety of nutritional interventions in it. Not only ones that affect the temporal pattern of feeding, like intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding, as well as caloric restriction, but also differences in macronutrient composition. That's a big area. But the mounting evidence on plant-based diets is really gathering attention, and it's conceivable that where we have a trial like that, there could be an arm on that. It's certainly, I think, but other than that, just in terms of investigator-initiated research, it's important. Of course, it's not just unique to NIA, and in fact, much of the interest on this has really come from cancer and cardiovascular research, and I'm sure that there are contacts at those other institutes with interest in that, and that perhaps is an extension of, I think, what John alluded to is one of our roles, if we get an email from you about a project, is not only to know who at NIA would be good to talk about, but who at the other institutes. And for plant-based diets, that's certainly the case. There are contacts at those other institutes who could be very pertinent. Max?
Yeah, so I started at NIA 8 years ago, right? So my first workshop is on the microbiome, 8 years ago. I tried to do something, the field was not quite ready at the time, because it was very difficult to study microbiome or microbiota, right, in human or in animals, right? So at that time, I didn't know much about aging. I was thinking maybe older people have a special pattern of kind of a microbiota. That'd be great. Then we can study that. It's not that simple, right? So now we know more and more. I think right now I think two major issues in the field. One is different people use a different method for sample collection and different sequencing method, right? So in terms how we can get people to do the same thing, can compare, right? So that's one thing, right? Second thing is, for human and animal models, they're microbiome and microbiota are very different, right? But with the microbiome and microbiota studies, of course, diet is a very important thing, right? So I think, there is one good study published about a year and a half ago in Cell by Meng Wang's group, right? So they studied a genome-wide mutant, right? So in worm, right, try to study the change. They found something very interesting. I think there are rooms, for study microbiome and the diet in animal models and try to help us to understand, the human, microbiome pattern, right? So it's many ongoing effort at the NIA right now. I'm happy to see that, after 80 years.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if anything, we're saying more than 80% of our funding goes to applications that came, truly investigator-initiated research, that came just to the parent grants for the mechanisms. So we do try to push science, and there's a huge internal competition to get set-aside funds or to get special review or something. That's part of what we do. We do a big battle every summer to get at that money to get specific things. But most of what we're funding is not in response to an FOA that said, here's our idea. You must do this. So don't feel you must. Max was right to say, look for an FOA dealing with your topic, but don't stop if you don't see one. That just means that whoever is interested in that didn't manage to get some of the set-aside funds recently, or we decided it was so obvious we didn't need to call special attention to it. We come along later and take credit for what you've done, but we may not have anticipated it. I notice, and I haven't done a count, but certainly of the research results I mentioned, and I believe a large percentage of what Richard Hodis mentioned came in over the transom. We're now calling your attention to it as if we had thought of it in the first place, but we didn't.
Thank you guys for being here today. I have a question about diversity supplements. I understand the application process, but I guess I'm wondering if you could give any insight or advice as to how the review process for that works, and what are the focuses that we should be trying to target in applications for this supplement?
Well, all the divisions participate in that, so I can just make a general comment. They're reviewed by a committee that involves all divisions, and I think it's this will just sound like a cliche, but it's true. Again, it really relates both to the plan for the awardee. How good is the plan? Is it, what will it do for the awardee? How good is the science? Is there really evidence of a commitment from the principal investigator for this to happen? Those are all kind of standard, but that's really what's applied. I don't think there's any other secret criteria for this.
I was on that committee until recently. The criteria, the committee, first of all, there's a great program. I'm delighted that Max reminded us by his broad arrow there. It's extra money that can be attached to virtually any grant, including center grants, to support participation of a scientist at any age. It can be high school kids on up to just about to retire professors, but most of them tend to be younger scholars. And the idea is to diversify the scientific workforce along several dimensions. Racial, ethnic is one of them. There are other areas of dimensions of diversity that we care about. One of the things I often see that's critically and sort of subtracts from the attractiveness of an application is if it looks like this isn't particularly going anywhere. Just this is, I don't want to use a cliche, but this person is coming on as an extra pair of hands to work on a project that's already totally worked out, it's not really building their career. We're looking for both things. This is advantageous to the project to which it's attached, otherwise it's not particularly valuable. But it's also helping someone move on in their career, develop new skills, develop in a good environment. Just a reminder, there's also re-entry supplements. These are quite rare. If someone is re-entering a scientific career, having spent time doing dependent care of any sort, child, older person or something, if they're getting back into it, we have money for that too, and we will add money to an existing grant to facilitate the participation of that person. That is less widely known, less publicized, fewer applications, would love to see more.
I just want to add two things. The first, after you submit it, so your program officer will write the review, right? So this review will be provided to the committee, right, to make a decision. So your program officer is important. So before you submit it, make sure you communicate with your program officer, and he or she understand, your need. Right? So that's first thing. Second thing is, it's very easy to get. So if you are eligible, you should try it.
So do you support the R21 application? And another question is that Dr. Gore talked about the emerging science. Could you provide a little bit more information? For example, we are working on the organoid culture.
Yeah, first on the R21, right? So I know where the question comes from, right? Because many institutes at NIH don't support the general R21. For example, NIGMS, NIDDK, NCI, they don't. So many proposals come to us, even they don't study aging. So but the answer is NIA still support the R21 and the R3 mechanism. So for anything you study, you think R21, R3 are good mechanism, and it is about aging. Come to us. So.
Yeah, just caution. We on occasion we've seen basically non-aging applications submitted to NIA as R21s, and if it's really not on aging, we can turn them back, and we will. So, but we find the mechanism useful. Just if you'll indulge me in one afterthought on an earlier question about interdisciplinary work, is the one mechanism that can be very good for that is the R33 network, or a hybrid of that, which starts with an R21 and then transitions to an R33. In terms of putting together new collaborations, new networks or collaborations that can cross disciplines, including basic and clinical, or all sorts of other interdisciplinary collaborations. Those can be a good platform then to develop to later R01s or program projects or other larger research grants. And they're fairly substantial resources for the R33, up to $500,000 a year. For example, one example of that was the Translational Geroscience network. Actually was an earlier network to just explore. That was, I think, funded by an R24. Then when they had a bigger network to fund, that was funded by an R33. A lot of those R33 networks can really build a lot of developmental work and infrastructure, not just for interdisciplinary work, and I'd encourage people to think about that if it might fit their interests.
Yes, here you go.
My question is about the trend. Do you plan to build more opportunities for the synesthesia research as a new trend?
Sorry, what research is it?
About the research trend. Do you plan to build more synesthesia research opportunities as a new funding, the grant trend?
So whether the senescence area is going to be... Right, we have been supporting senescence research for many, many years, right? So right now, for the funding opportunity for the new trend, we see the new trend, there is more attention paid to the senescence study. But for us, to support something, it has to be unique. For example, senescence, if, we come up or other people come up with some unique angle, right? So for example, right now senescence, they use P16 as marker, right? But there is possibility maybe, some senescent cells don't have a P16 marker, right? So are there some other senescent, some other kind of senescent cells, right? But those kind of questions would, merit, RFA or future initiative, right? But right now, nothing going on with the senescence research being considered for RFA. Is that right?
Right. Right. There aren't. If there was an RFA in the offing, we couldn't tell you anyway. Except this is a useful thing though. Is when new concepts for initiatives are reviewed by our National Advisory Council, that is when there is targeted funding, as a matter of public record, the approved concepts for initiatives are posted on the NIH website as public information. Not many, but not all of those do turn into RFAs, and so people do look at them to see what might be likely for RFAs, and that's available on the website. And generally, there's been a blog from NIA about it. So, for example, currently, the concepts that were reviewed at our September Advisory Council are on the NIA website. You can see which those were for initiatives. No guarantee they'll all turn into RFAs, but there's a high probability that a lot of them would. That's public information. The other thing I can mention is we recently did have a conference on the issues relating to phase 2 clinical trials of senolytics. This is related to interest in clinical trials translation of that. That doesn't mean there's going to be an RFA, but what it clearly identifies, there are real research needs for this, and Max alluded to that too, is, especially for human studies. I think I mentioned that when I told you this, there's just a whole lot of properties of cells that may not just be one senescent cell type or another. It's really, so just in terms of understanding what you can measure in humans to find out what you're targeting and what the consequences would be, that's a very important area for research, and we'd certainly like to see applications on it. Whether there's going to be an RFA about it, it's another issue.
Okay, I think we need one more question.
Yeah, so can any of you speak to the NIH Early Career Reviewer program and how you may be expanding that to postdocs or potentially trainees in the future, if that's of interest?
Thank you. I had a note here. I have a list here of things we didn't talk about, and that was on it. Very much encourage you to look at that. It's on the webpage of the Center for Scientific Review. And the idea is that early career people who may not be the PI of an R01 or haven't been asked yet to be a reviewer should take the initiative and join one. I've seen it in action. It works. It's very interesting. It's working very well. But people are doing real reviews with the real reviewers in a study section, and everybody I've talked to who's done it has said they learned an immense amount about how the review system works, and it affects how they write grants and the rest of it. So I don't know about what changes are coming up in the program. I've heard great things, and I do encourage you to look at the Center for Scientific Review, so NIH CSR, and it's prominently on their webpage, and consider joining that.
All right, well, thank you. Yes, one other thing, sure.
Small businesses, if you're connected to a small business, or if you've always been thinking about commercialization of something you're doing, either because there's a market for it as helping older people directly, or products or services or ideas or software that will help people do research that contributes to older people's health and welfare, please, this is something where we need more applications, we need more good applications, and we've recently hired a new person to run the division. He's really energetic, and they'll be really helpful. So if any of your ideas relate to possible future commercialization, do consider that as a option. Thanks.
Thanks to everybody.